Evening, everybody. I can't see any of you because I'm in the spotlights and you're all in the shadows. But I'll start just by saying a little bit broadly around the subject. Andrew got me here to talk about regeneration and the Fringe. And when I took on the subject, I didn't know that there would be an entire mountain here before me talking about a fringe to Cape Town, which is a far bigger topic than the one I'm going to talk about. The fringe I'm talking about is a very, very small area in Cape Town, and you may recognize that this is the central city. You can see the castle, and I'm going to talk about the fringe here. But it does have some resonance for the wider subject that Table Mountain talked about earlier. Just by way of introduction, I'm an architect, I'm an urban designer. I recently returned to Cape Town after many years in the UK, far too many. But I studied here before that. I have long roots in Cape Town. And this city is, in a way, my adopted city, but it's also my family city, going back many generations. I'm going to start my story. Several months ago, I found myself in this kind of vast abandoned space, an old building in Woodstock that many years ago used to whir to the click of machines, and for several years now has lain completely vacant, taken over by a whole brood and host of pigeons who live, shit, and die. And that is now the life of this building. And it's a tragedy that has visited many of our buildings in the city. You may recognize this as the Rex Trueform building in Woodstock. And it has fallen foul of the demise of the garment industry in Cape Town. It's not the only one. It's probably the poster boy, poster child. This is another building in Parow, designed, funny enough, by the same architect. This building is still used for manufacture of shoes, but of those 4 floors, only one is still used for manufacture. The other 3 are used for storage of goods previously manufactured in South Africa in Cape Town, now shipped in from China, of course. And so this building, which used to employ thousands, now employs hundreds. The story of Cape Town and the story of regeneration is a story about what is the raison d'etre of a city, what makes it tick. What I do as an architect and an urban designer is I think about the buildings and spaces, but really there are buildings and spaces that are about housing a particular raison d'etre for a city, its industries and its thought processes. So for Cape Town, this view gives us a wonderful sense of the city as a mecca for tourists and as a place of logistics. But that surely is not enough to sustain us going forward. So what is the future for the city? Well, our very successful bid to be design capital in 2014 tells us what a creative place we are. And in fact, if you do an analysis of the creative industries in the central city, which somebody else did, not me, a man who I should credit, a man by the name of Jean Lawrence, and it's a very good analysis, but it tells us how densely occupied the city is by various of these creative industries. I don't know if you can read, but they span everything from advertising to the visual arts. There's no Z, but there is an A to B. And Cape Town has a very well-deserved reputation for the creative industries. Now, the Fringe project that I'm going to talk about tonight is an initiative of Western Cape Government, of the City Council, and of Cape Town Partnership to take this core business that we already do pretty well in Cape Town, the creative industries, this passion for innovation, the role Cape Town plays in media. You'll know that the film industry is very well established in this country. And to carve out for Cape Town a future using this as a cornerstone of the future development of the city. And the focus for this future is this place that we're standing in right now, which is the Fringe. The Fugard Theatre is one of the first regenerated buildings in the Fringe. And it's a small area that lies between the city. It's on the edge of the city, hence the Fringe, but it's also on the edge of District 6 that we heard so much about earlier. And it is, in a very real way, an interface between these two things. A city that, as Bonita so eloquently spoke about is a place that used to be a place of distance for many people, but is now, thankfully, a much more integrated place. And another place that was erased, has so much still in the way of memory, and is being recreated in a sense. It is being recreated in a physical sense. It is also being recreated in a sense of memory. But what I think one of the real purposes of the Fringe project, it may not be a core purpose in terms of its original sponsors, but I think a core purpose of this project is to recapture that fundamental essence of District 6 to a certain extent. That was its aliveness, its activity, its place of making things, its place of craftspeople. And the new crafts, in many senses, in the 21st century, are in the worlds of computing, are in the worlds of design, are in the worlds of creativity, are in the worlds of bespoke fashion, and etc., etc. So I'm going to start off with a few drawings and diagrams and images of what the Fringe looks like now. This place of interface between the kind of very much erased and fragmented areas of District 6 and the more solid areas of the existing CBD. And this diagram is one that we did in my office that looks at how the old Dutch grid creates the 60 by 60 grid that was talked about in the Table Mountain interview, creates a very kind of conventional sense of city with well-ordered streets and buildings fronting them. And then if we look at what's left of District 6, some of the fragments of District 6, some of the newer buildings that have come in subsequently, they are fragmented, they break up, there's areas of vacant space, what we often call lost space. The buildings don't sit happily on the streets. It's a place that, with or without its history, spatially simply feels, to my mind, sad. And we've started to capture some of these thoughts in this diagram, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm an architect, so I do work with maps and I do work with plans, and I realize that a lot of you people may find them challenging to read, which is why we put words on, so it can help you. And colors, of course. But what this one is really talking about is the notion that we have a kind of an institutional bit of the city and a conventional bit of the city. We have a massive area between the station and this area of the city that has a whole series of fragmented cultural institutions, but there could be something more. We have this core area that becomes the Fringe, which has a delightful collection of buildings and spaces, but it's not quite held together. We have this historical lump of apartheid modernist intervention, CPUT, a very inward-looking spatial environment. And the same is not true, I must immediately add, of the institution itself, which is actually pretty forward-thinking, but they've inherited this rather unfortunate physical space. And between that, we have the fragmented and discontinuous built environment that remains of this lower portion of District 6. Now, the clearances and the fringiness of this central space has meant that it's been neglected for many years. And it's had some kind of fortunate side effects. It has a very interesting collection of architecture. In particular, from the sort of heroic modern period. And you'll see this sort of interesting collection of buildings from Art Deco from the 1930s, from the 1950s, that all have certain characteristics of horizontals and verticals, and they're very kind of gritty buildings, and they were built as warehouses, and they actually add a lot to the physical and spatial character of this place. And they've attracted some very, very interesting occupants and users, from the Fugard Theatre, where we are now, the DS Tavern, which I'm sure many of you have frequented, and it's a very cheerful place. The Heritage Resources Agency, Cape Town Library, design students at CPUT, and then also, of course, the East City Boxing Club. So there's a very varied group of people and institutions that inhabit this place, and also add to the grit and vibrancy of the area. So let's think a bit about the Fringe and what it could be. In our study in looking at the future of the Fringe, we decided to look at a lot of other places around the world, And there were a few key lessons that we wanted to learn. The first was thinking about streets and what kind of places these streets could evolve to be. You know, we're very used in our suburban areas to have streets where nothing happens except cars drive past each other and hoot or swerve or try and get out of each other's way. But actually one thing that we're very familiar with, certainly I found in my years in Europe, is the notion of the market street and streets thronging with activity, and streets that are fundamentally for pedestrians where cars are very secondary. And this is a core lesson that we want to bring to the Fringe. The notion of temporary activities. Very low investment can bring in a lot of activity by kind of pop-up parks. We have one here in an old skip. This guy has turned his parking place into a barbecue. It's in the States, but we call it a braai. He calls it the Deepistan National Park because his origin is actually Pakistani. And then little sidewalk cafes, a fold-up coffee shop, a little gallery, and other shops. Galleries, public art, public events, fashion shows, the things that bring people into the streets need not be heavy investment into buildings. The things that regenerate places, the things that make places attractive. These are the kinds of things we want to look at. Lighting plays a very important role. Again, not a major investment item, not as much as bricks and mortar, but can totally transform a space. Street furniture can totally change the character of and recreate the way we use spaces. And having functional street furniture, like I'm not going to try and go back, but cast your mind back. That bicycle rack that is also a piece of art, which happens to come from Vancouver. So let me get on to what's proposed for this area. And I'll start with a fairly dry and boring slide, apart from a nice bit of graffiti on the right-hand side that you may recognize from a building in the Fringe. But we started off with a key set of objectives on the left-hand side, and tying into those a set of 8 principles that govern all of the strategy and planning work that has gone forward. This was the first drawing we did, and again, you know the castle. This is the core area of the Fringe, and this is the Fugard bit here. We looked at the nature of the existing streets and how their character might be transformed to become streets of particular character. And Harrington Street, which runs down just along here, past the big parking lot where many of you probably parked, at the moment is very much a back street. It's a service street. But we reimagine the street as becoming the core activity street of the area, the street that's fronted by shops, by studios, by workshops, a street that might have a market in it, and a street that people will cycle down and will walk down, rather than one that is largely full of vans, as it is today. Long Market Street, which is the yellow one running that way, is already a pedestrian environment. Let's create it as a much stronger pedestrian environment. Bacon Cunt Street, which is in blue, is public transport, and the others follow. We looked at how do we structure this as a new set of city blocks, which are those that are in red, where we can actually start to get over this fragmented and discontinuous space that we have left over from District 6 and recreate city blocks where buildings are edging streets and creating the spaces of streets, and that the more private spaces are inside where they can be properly used by the people who live or work in those buildings. We looked at creating particular public spaces. A key one sits here. Currently, this is a major traffic intersection where vehicles rush past. And we think that this place can be transformed with some minor interventions that can make it what we call a gateway space into the area, tying into the IRT system. There'll be a gateway space into the Fringe. It'll also be a gateway space for students arriving to come to CPUT over here. Pedestrian movement. As Dave was saying, pedestrian movement is going to be key to the way the IRT works in the city. And so creating pedestrian routes is critical. The thing about pedestrian routes is it's not just a line on a map. It actually needs to be, how do these streets work? What kind of buildings front these streets? how do the ground floors of these streets make people feel safe? How do you like these streets? Are they comfortable to walk on? That ties in with this system of IRT, which is the IRT is the green lines and the red dots are where the IRT would stop. And then we have an open space system. So Harrington Square, where most of you, and indeed I did, park tonight, gets reimagined as the core public space in this area. So let's rip out the cars, let's put down some paving. Let's try and imagine what was there before. There used to be a church on that square. It was razed to the ground as part of the removals that took place during District 6. I'm not suggesting we rebuild the church, but somehow we can recapture the memory of that in the space. Built form, in many ways the least important, because this is where many other architects will come in and fill in the gaps as long as we set up the right rules. But the important thing to say about built form is that we would create conditions whereby buildings are, as I said earlier, not stepping back and putting up big fences between themselves and the streets, but becoming the wall of the street space. We've set regulations for appropriate building height. We've also started to indicate what types of buildings we might have in the area. And I think what's critical to point out is the notion of perimeter blocks. Buildings that are infill, that don't try and stand out. There is some room for kind of more iconic buildings in the design part as that comes along. There are 23 projects that come out of this. This is a kind of artist's visualization of what this place will look like from the air.